Well, good afternoon, everyone. So glad to see you here at my favorite science museum. I'm David Dundee. I'm Director of Education, and I'm so glad you've come to another Lunch and Learn. As I always do, I want to just tell you about some exciting events coming up here at the museum. Our next big event at the museum is in October 14. We'll have Heavy Metal in Motion. No, it's not a Led Zeppelin concert. We're bringing all sorts of big machines to the museum, from agricultural equipment to helicopters and road building equipment and fire engines and all sorts of cool stuff. And so if you would like to meet the people who run those big machines and see them, we'll even have a simulator that you can operate, the care of Matthews and Sons, one of the big contractors that does road building all over Atlanta, that you can learn how to run some of the big machines that they use. And also we've scheduled, thanks to our stellar astronomer, a partial solar eclipse that day, so you can come by if the weather's good and also observe that in the observatory. Well, our next Lunch and Learn will be on September 13th. We'll have Dr. Christopher Britt here. Actually, he'll be here as a virtual guest. He's going to be talking from Baltimore to us about the first years of science with the James Webb Telescope and some of the discoveries and beautiful images coming back from that, and also talking a little bit about the Hubble Space Telescope as well. On September 15th, we have Dr. Ben Barden's going to be here for our lecture series at 7 p.m. In our big theater, and he'll be talking about common sports injuries, and we'll be opening an exhibit that night all about sports called Sportsology, so you might want to come back to see that. And if you want to learn more about astronomy, we have a lunar workshop on the 22nd of September. You can sign up for that online, and it's a lot of fun learning how to observe the moon in our observatory. And if you want to have even more fun, we have stand-up comedy here at Tellus. Believe it or not, Georgia Tech has a group of scientists that are a comedy troupe, and they do stand-up comedy. And if it's 21 and older there that night, but it is on the night of September 29th, so you might want to come by and see that. So we have all sorts of cool stuff. If you're into looking through our telescope but don't like being out at night, that's not a problem. We have a solar sky watch on September 9th, and the observatory will be open during the day looking at sunspots. I can pretty much guarantee you're going to see sunspots. The sun is really active right now, so it's lots to see. The only thing that you're required to do is bring clear weather with you, because cloudy weather, it doesn't look very good. Those of you who are into Girl Scouting, we have a Cadets and Senior Scouts astronomy workshop on September 9th. So there's still some space left in that. Well, today we have a talk about Morse Code, and thanks to our own educator, Bob Finger, who's been here at the museum ever since the museum's been open. He's one of our senior museum educators, and he teaches all the programs throughout our galleries. He's a great educator, and he's also, his former life, an engineer, and so he has all sorts of interesting interests in things like the making Morse code and how the equipment works to make that happen. So, without any more ado, I'd like you all to welcome our lecturer today, Mr. Finger, and we'll dash off to your talk.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it is so nice to see this big crowd today. And you know, I was thinking back, ever since man has been civilized and living together and needing to send information back and forth, we've been trying to figure out better ways of doing this. And so in the early days, a lot of times we would light fires, for example, to signal that an enemy was coming or not coming or something. And of course, I hope most of you have read Paul Revere's Ride by Longfellow. And if you remember, what was the signal for the British? One if by land and two if by sea, right? So we've been trying to, get high-speed communications for a long time. Well, with the discovery of electricity, there followed a myriad of different devices and ideas and signaling components that came up. And perhaps one of the most interesting parts of this is Morse Code. It offered a high-speed way to communicate with each other with relatively simple equipment. And so this code that was developed has literally changed the world and is continuing to. But where did this come from? Who were the inventors? And how is it still impacting our lives today? These are some of the questions that we will explore in this brief talk about the history and usage of Morse code. Now, I have up here some pictures of some famous gentlemen. One of these you might not recognize, Joseph Henry. He was the guy that invented the doorbell. And we all know how much we love our doorbells, right? But actually, the doorbell created an electronic or electrical relay that was based and gave the technology that was needed by Samuel Morse and also Alfred Vail. And so they were able to take this idea and come up with an idea of how that they could use a wire or a couple of wires and send signals back and forth using this relay and making noises and things like that. Now, it's kind of interesting, the background. Samuel Morse was a painter, and he was a very well-established portrait painter. In fact, that may be a self-portrait, I'm not sure. And our other guy up there, Alfred Vail, he was an engineer, so I bet he kind of worked out some of the details of how to make the sounds and so forth. And one last thing about Joseph Henry that's kind of interesting. He was also an American inventor, and like I said, he created the doorbell. But one of the cool things was he was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institute and Museum. So all these men had very distinguished career paths. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of these early signaling devices. I've got pictured up here one of those such devices. And these devices were possible because of discoveries by Ørsted, who was a chemist and physicist, and he came up and discovered, electromagnetism. And later on, Surgeon, who was a self-taught educator, physicist, and mathematician, was able to invent electromagnets, which we all use today because it's basically just an iron core with a bunch of wire around it that does pretty wonderful things for us. And the device pictured here is kind of obscure, but I thought it was one of the coolest ones I could find a picture. And this one had an armature in it. Now, who knows what an armature is? Well, a few of you do, but for the rest of you, that's the part in the center of the motor that turns. And so they were actually able to use multiple wires coming to this device. They were able to make the armature turn, and it would point out numbers and letters on the scale. So if you were an operator, you would sit down and they sent you some type of alert signal, I'm sure, and then you would write down the message. And do you think this was very fast? Well, it's all relative. It is pretty slow by today's standards, but if you were sending a message on a horse with a rider out to somebody, this was a lot faster way to send that message and receive that message. And as I said, a lot of these had multiple wires to them, so they were kind of a complicated device, but they did work pretty well during that time. So there was still a need for something that was going to be much faster and much better. Well, a big jump forward was when people started looking at dials and started trying to hear the sounds. And so here we see an example of an early telegraph key. And by the way, just in case you're interested, you'll get a chance to play with one of these if you want to, because they still are making these telegraph keys today, and they're still used by a lot of amateur radio operators and others. Anyway, they came up with this idea of the key, and I don't have an example of the sounder up there, but in our Crossroads exhibit from Georgia Power, we actually do have one of those sounders that you could take a look at. And so basically what would happen is they'd press the key, it would make a click, okay? And so that clicking sound was, thought to be the one way to do it. Some people tried using bars of ivory with metal and various combinations, But anyway, it used sound, which meant that the operator didn't have to look at anything. He'd just sit there, or she'd sit there, and they just write. And so this was a big improvement on trying to send the messages across the wire. Now, this, as you might have guessed and might have heard, this Morse code is kind of musical sounding, okay? And so once they didn't have to look down and write, they could just concentrate on hearing these different sounds. And so it's really important, though, to establish something has a standard for how these sounds are made. Now, when I talk to you today, when I talk about the little dot that we often see it represented by, that is called a dit. So I'll be speaking to you not in dots, but in terms of dits. And then the longer symbol is called a da. Now, how can this all work together? Well, if you use the dit as your original standard, then a da is 3 dits long, and then you would have 7 dits between words and 3 dits between letters. So it won't matter, how fast or how slow you're sending it, as long as you maintain that rhythm and that relationship between the different words you're trying to send or different letters, then this will work at almost any speed that you want to send it to. Now, these musical type symbology has made its way into a lot of our culture today. Does anybody remember Glenn Campbell and his song, The Wichita Lineman? Maybe some of us old guys do, but it kind of had a Morse code sound to it. It really wasn't code, but it's kind of sounded like it. Also, if you love the Beatles, the song Strawberry Fields Forever had some Morse code embedded in it, or Morse code sounding. If you're really into Pink Floyd, which I'm not, but anyway, in the astronomy doctrine, he used Morse code as part of it. But maybe a little closer to home, anybody remember the first Star Wars movie? And there was a scene where Chewbacca had been captured and they were leading him away to a cell. And there was a little bitty bot that was running around and it was going, da da did it, until Chewbacca growled at it and it ran off in fear. He was sending the Morse code letter Z, and so I thought it's made its way there. And lest you think that it's totally gone, there are some tools out there to help you learn to sing the Morse code. We have a website we call Morse Base that's ran by some folks, and we're going to demonstrate that, afterwards in the Stay and Explore. And I think you will really enjoy just hearing some of the things that they are doing with that. And, I've been told that lately in our culture that there are now bracelets and rings that people are wearing that have Morse code messages on them. So once you learn the code, you can really find out what your friends are wearing around their wrist. Okay, so let's talk about the code and how it might have changed. The original Morse or American or railroad or American Morse was original code in the 1840s. And I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but we've got some better handouts that we can give you later. But you can see that in there are certain letters that have changed. And if you can see the letter O, and is one of them, for example, and I'm having a hard time seeing it, but what happens is it actually was one form, and then it changed to another and to another. And the Europeans were in this too because they had something that they called continental code, mainly used in Germany and Austria, and it sometimes was called Gurkey as the name of the code around 1851, and it was different from the American Morse. So that kind of caused some confusion, especially if you were sending communications across the seas, as Marconi did later. So what happened in 1865, they were able to settle on one set of symbols, and this is called the International Morse Code, and we'll be able to look at it a little bit better. But the one thing I wanted to point out that's really obvious, if you look at the very bottom of the code up there, those are the numbers. And you can see how the numbers were kind of erratic under American Morse, kind of a big block under a Gurkey. And then the International Morse Code now kind of looks like an M, but it makes more sense because you don't have to listen for the silences. One of the things that most people don't realize with Morse code, the dits and the das are very important, but also the silence is very important. It helps us to figure out, things about the letters and how they're spaced and all of that. And so if you were using the original Morse code, it could be confusing sometimes to actually pick out the characters because of the silences that were in there. So this new code, the International, has been around for a long, long time, and it's worked very well. Now, kind of the golden age of Morse code was back in the mid-1800s through World War II, approximately. During this time, it was very important for the war efforts, both in World War I and World War II, and also with the advancements from the simple spark gap transmitters like Marconi used. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of these, but we've all seen something that arcs and makes an electrical spark, right? Well, that's basically what his transmitter was, and it produced all kinds of RF frequencies. Most of them we didn't want, so today that kind of transmitter is illegal to use everywhere because of all of its interference. But we got into vacuum tubes, and we could control things better, and then into transistors. So it just got better and better. And so we were able to send not only over telegraph wires, but in undersea cables, and also through the air on radio. So many of these operators, like the guy in the bottom, some of this equipment is still around today. It's being used by amateur operators, and you can still buy it. I ran across a catalog the other day that had a bunch of old transmitters they used to carry in aircraft. Okay, so that was great, but something happened. Does anybody know what happened right off? How about computers? Yeah, because you see, to actually send a signal with Morse code, the fastest operators that were known were sending about 60 words a minute, and so that meant that it took them 200 milliseconds to send the letter A. And on a computer, you could send it much faster, but most of us don't really know what 200 milliseconds is, do we? So I want everybody to get your hands up like this for me. We're going to do a little exercise. Now watch me. If I take these two fingers and I touch them like that, just touch them like that. Okay, everybody try it with feeling now. Here we go. That touch is about 128 milliseconds. And I got really good at this at one time back, I won't tell you how many years ago with computers, but when we sent the escape character, what we did was we actually broke the signal, and we did it like that, just 128 milliseconds, and the computer realized that that was an escape character. But that gives you an idea of how short or how long, however you want to look at it. But the thing of it is, if you have a modern computer using a modern code like ASCII, or there's many others out there, you might be able to transmit hundreds of A's in that 1 millisecond, let alone if you were going 200 milliseconds, you could probably send a whole message or even download a program. So it really, knocked it out of the loop, for high-speed communications at that time. So it was ironic but sad, but we started having these commercial stations that sent Morse code, mainly located on the east and west coast, shutting down because they'd be transmitting like to Europe or to ships or to Asia or somewhere like that. And the last one of these, according to urban legend, sent the first message that was sent with Morse code when it shut down, and it was called, "What Hath God Wrought?" And so that was kind of a neat thing. But there are some of these old stations out on the West Coast that have been preserved as museums. So if you're ever out there, you might get a chance to actually see one of these things. They're pretty cool. Well, the military decided they didn't need it as much. Commercial didn't need it as much. So whatever happened to this? Well, it's not gone away, friends. It is still there. It is far from obsolete, even though that it is kind of a slow form of digital communication, because remember, it's on and off, and it's just like what our computers do when they send an ASCII code, it's on and off, but it's long form. So if you're transmitting a digital signal and you have a big crash of lightning that knocks out, maybe 30 or 40 milliseconds of your signal, you've lost a lot of data. But an operator, a ham radio operator or another Morse code operator, they can listen to the code and they can actually pick it up and they can continue with the message in many cases. Same is true with voice communications. A lot of times crashes will knock that out, How many people were listening to their AM radio last night with all that lightning in the area? You know, there was a lot of interference going on. So code is what I like to term as a long-term transmission relative, you know, to what computers, which makes it still very valuable, you know, for that kind of thing. Now, some branches of the armed forces still use code quite a bit. You've seen the blinkers that they have on Navy ships that being demonstrated, I'm sure, in movies. Air Force, Army, and the others, depending on what your job is, you still need to know this. If you're a communications officer, you still know how to use this. And there's been this old saying, you know, that when everything else fails, Morse will get through. And also, if anybody here a pilot or flies planes a little bit? Okay. And how about your VOR and ADFs? Do they have CW identifiers? Yep, they sure do. And so like in Rome, Georgia, where I live, it's RMG to identify the Rome, Georgia airport on your approach there to land. So it's still really something vital. And just to show you how important it is to our government, you can still get a radio, I never can say this word, telegraphy license if you can pass the code test and the written test. And you still got jobs available on ships at sea a lot of times. So we have found them in many, many places. Now you might say, well, we've got computers today. Can't they just read the code? And do we really need to train all these people? I think the fastest guy that is alive today that can copy can only do 140 words a minute, which is still pretty slow. And the news is that since the beginning of this Morse code thing, we've actually had machines that could read code. In the top, we've got a paper tape machine. It would be feeding the tape through, and as it receives the long and short clicks, it would actually make marks on the paper, and then an operator could take it, read it, and then send the message or write the message out and give it to whoever. And he had a hard copy of it, so, you know, that was pretty neat. But, you know, I had one little problem. Does anybody know what the problem is? Anybody want to guess? It was still really slow, okay? So it might take a long time to get that message across. The bottom is a little portable device, and I've got one of these at home. I didn't bring it because it's a little finicky to use sometimes, but it will actually, you can hold it in your hand, and it'll actually read Morse code coming off of a transmitter. And I've got my receiver there and have it set up just right, and we can actually read it. And it's not the only way, because there are a number of computer programs that are out there being used that will do send and receive. There's one called FL Digi, which is one that's a favorite of a lot of my friends, and it will hear the code. You can type out the message you want to send and hit return, and it will switch on your transmitter, and you can send it back to the person who sent it to you. Now, the code coming out of these computers is perfect. I mean, absolutely perfect. And a lot of the old-time real CW, I forgot to define CW. In ham radio and other services, we call it continuous wave, because whenever you press down the transmit, you're sending out a continuous wave until you release the switch, and then you've got a break. Same thing your code key's doing. It's sending out electrical circuit power until you break it. But anyway, these operators can complain often that if you hear somebody using a computer, you can always tell it's them because there's no human element in it. There's no mistakes, no problems, or anything like that. Okay, so where could I learn more? Well, this is just one site. This is the k8zt.com site that I'm only showing you a small portion of it here. Anyway, on this site, Anthony has got probably about 80 different places you can go to learn all about the code. We're going to have it set up on one of our computers over here. So if you want to scroll through it, take a look at it, and see what it looks like, I think you'll find it to be really interesting. All right, now it's time to have a little fun with code, okay? And I want to start out by letting you hear a little bit about Morse base. And I'm going to hope that, I've only done this once, so I'm going to hope that it's going to work, okay? So let's see if we can hear a little bit about that Morse base that I mentioned a while ago in the music. Anybody hear that okay? Got a nice rhythm to it. What do you think? Anybody ready to dance to it? So you get the idea, of how that they can use music to help teach it. Also, I want to teach you a little bit of Morse code too. I have up here a Morse code oscillator, and it's a real kind of fancy one that was real popular in about 1958. So it's a little bit dated, but it still makes some sound, and it's a little hard to send Morse code standing up. So if I make a mistake, will you guys forgive me? Well, maybe a few of you will. Anyway, let's hear what an E sounds like, a single dit. You want to hear that again? Yeah, it's just a single sound. Now, the da should be about 3 times longer. Oh, made a mistake. When you make a mistake, you send. That's error, okay? So here, I send that a lot sometimes. Anyway, here's the da. Okay, so we can kind of put it together, and I'm going to try to send to you the word T, like a golf tee. Okay, so did you get that one? All right, so now you know Morse code already. But anyway, that's how we can put it together. Now there's 2 other really popular letters that everybody should know, because this could save your life. It's the letter S and the letter O. The letter S is 3 dits, and the letter O is 3 das. And so you can send. Anybody know what that was? Yeah, SOS. Help me, Now, there's one thing that's interesting, because, as you can see, sending whole words could be a real problem sometimes. And so we were able to put letters just jammed up against each other, like SOS at the bottom, and that is called a prosign. And like the SK that you might have noticed on the farewell page there a while ago to Morse code, the SK meant end of transmission, and the SOS, of course, is save our ship. And there's maybe hundreds of these things. And when you get to be a really, really good Morse code operator, you're not listening for letters anymore. You're listening for whole phrases, like the word the, or cat, or Mississippi, or something like that. You're just listening for those whole groupings, which really increases your speed quite a bit. All right, so this has been a brief introduction to Morse code, and I think it's going to be around for a very, very long time, because it's so embedded in our culture and our heritage. And so I want to take a brief time now to see if there's any questions and answers. And before you ask, that is Q, ampersand, and A in Morse code. Yes, Morse code has a lot of punctuation in it too. And your really good operators really know all that punctuation. I know a few, but I don't use it that much, to send really formal messages. All right, anybody got any questions? David will come to you.
So I have a question about the spaces between words and letters. Are there spaces between each letter to where you're able to distinguish like where it begins and ends? And also, are there any between words?
Yes. Between each letter, there should be 3 dits, and then between each word, there should be 7 dits. So that's why it's kind of... Pardon me? Yes. Yes, and you'll kind of, as you practice with Morse code, you'll get to the point where you can just kind of instinctively hear that and don't have to try to count it out. And that's why that you can send it at any speed you want to, as long as you maintain those rules, it will work. Okay?
All right, another question right here.
How do you receive?
How do we receive it? Well, it depends on what technology you're using. I showed you the little sounder, the magnetic sounder that they used originally. But today, most of us are receiving it on radios, and it's got what they call I don't want to get too complicated, but it makes a beeping sound that you can control. And so we usually just tune to where we want to hear something. When that carrier wave is on, it will make a beep, and when it's off, we've got silence. And of course, it's the combination of the silences and the sound that when it's on that makes us able to hear it. And you can also do it on your cell phone. There are some applications and things where you can play with it on your cell phone too.
The question right over here.
Okay, so I have a couple of quick questions. The first question is how much did the Carrington event back in the 1850s set the technology back? That, obviously was the large solar flare that set the telegraph wires on fire and all that. And the other question is, have you started seeing any technology such as artificial intelligence or machine learning being used to actually try to train an AI model how to interpret and then respond back with Morse code?
Well, the Carrington event, I'm not sure how much damage was done. I know that there was a lot of reports about headsets, burning up, and any time you had a coil of wire, you're going to get a big inductive charge. So it probably caused quite a bit of damage, at that time. It's nothing like what would happen today. If we had a Carrington event today, I mean, we'd be practically back in the Stone Age again with our dependence on electronics. As far as the AI, I have not looked into that. I would imagine it would be pretty easy to implement that, because once you could convert it into a computer code like ASCII or something, it should be very doable. And I would imagine, yeah, so that might be the next chatbot that somebody might want to come up with. Hey, I just gave you an idea to make a ton of money. Well, I really wouldn't say that there's not. There may be some people that want to fool other people by sending what appears to be a covert message, Who knows? It might catch on.
Okay, I think I saw a hand up way over here.
He wants me to ask.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Is this used for the International Space Stations or rocket ships at all, too?
I don't really know for sure. We do have some amateur radio people that do go to the space station, and they do communicate, but I don't know if they're only doing voice or if they're doing some Morse code. It's likely that there are some satellites that have a Morse code beacon, just for tracking, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. That'll give me a new one to look up. Thank you.
Okay, I have one more question right here.
How long did it take to make the first working prototype?
I was trying to find out an exact date on that, and we only know that it's sometime between 1836 and 1844. So I'm just not sure for Morse, when their actual prototype was made. Prior to that, and about the same time, we did have those needle devices I talked about with the armature where it was pointing. And so, and again, they're very obscure. There's not much information about who built it, how long it took, or any of those cool things that I'd really like to know. Good question, though.
Okay, I see. Okay, I got one more question over here. And after this question, my staff's going to be over in this corner for all my young scientists. We have a little interactive activity for Morse code in the corner there. So got one more question right over here.
Okay, I know when you see in older movies when somebody gets like a Western Union telegraph and it'll include the word stop, which I'm sure means like period or full stop. But how come they don't have like a different code for that, or they actually key in the word stop instead of a punctuation?
I didn't quite hear it, David.
The question was, why when you do telegrams, is the word stop at the end of phrases or end of the message, and why isn't there like a special key to say stop rather than typing out stop?
Oh, okay. Well, the stop was actually just a period, and that was why they're trying to show the end of the message. And I don't know, maybe they did do that at one point. As these things got better and better, they started automating some of those functions, but that's what they're meaning by saying stop. And we have the same thing to a degree, in sending code when we send SK, or sometimes just the letter K, meaning end the message. Good question.
Well, let's have a big hand for Mr. Finger.
Thank you.